All right, welcome back, everyone. So this video I think is going to be up a little bit later than the scheduled time, but anyway, we'll rush right into it. So today we're going to start talking about Chapter 4. I'm probably going to get just into the initial phases of it. I'm going to sort of triangulate the information in the chapter with some of my previous research, along with other research that I'm sort of doing currently. And anyway, I think it's through that we'll see, we'll be able to have a better idea of what some of these research methods entail. So the first thing, I do want to explain how this is going to sort of be laid out. So again, I'll be discussing my own research, which has broadly covered 3 areas. Initially, I had done a lot of research on ethnic cleansing in Darfur, in Sudan, Africa. And so I'll be discussing some of that as it's relevant. I've also, I think as I've mentioned, as I've talked about, have an interest in authoritarianism, and we're seeing a huge, surge of interest in that for various reasons. I've also begun doing research on fascism, which is kind of interesting because it's different than, or at least the line of research is different than that's been exploring authoritarianism and so on. And then I'll also every once in a while turn toward my own previous work on urban development and urban growth, which was done in California and in Oregon. So a broad range of areas. And of course, your textbook also has a number of great examples. So I'm not going to talk about the class too much, just kind of focus on the lecture material. If you do have questions about the mechanics of the class and schedules or anything like that, just send me an email. Okay. So as I said, first we start out with the concept, and this is essentially what you're going to be doing for next week. You're thinking of a research question, a research problem, but you're really at first just thinking of a concept of something that interests you, and it can be very different. So, different kinds of information, information is very complex. So even, the word tree, we might have some basic idea of what we're talking about, the outlines of a schema, as it's called in psychology. But it's going to be very different for not only for each person, but even within a person. So we can have different ideas, different concepts, mental images that, come to our consciousness when we hear a word, and so on. So, for example, as I said, I'm going to be drawing from my own research, which, for better or worse, is kind of dark, but maybe that will help you in memorization and so on. So again, you think of the word fascist, and if you type it in, a search engine, typically you'll get something, a picture of one of these guys, if not both of them, Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. So Mussolini was one of the authors of a major doctrine of fascism, which is what it was called. And I'll kind of talk about that when we're talking about gathering data and so on. I was just, I've done work and was long ago a teaching assistant for Simonetta Velasca-Zamponi, and she's done work on the aesthetics of power in fascist Italy. And I think what's particularly interesting there is that the aesthetics are still pretty similar. I mean, when you look at, modern fascist movements, there's a lot of emblems, there's a lot of, faux military type fatigues and things like that. Whether or not they're actually military or have been in the military or whatever. So again, there's this presentation of a strong idea and strong body and all of these things that go into the aesthetic aspect of fascism and fascist places. So again, today I'll be talking about that along with kind of this other thing that's similar but different. I've mentioned, a little bit about it before, authoritarian. When we talk about surveys, so we're not going to get into survey research today, but that's basically what I'll be covering on Wednesday. But we'll really get into how questions are asked, how to write a good survey question, also how to write bad ones and misleading ones. And you can see sometimes how research has gone really astray just because of some bad surveys that were done. One example is the authoritarian personality, in the sense that over the next few decades, I mean, literally like 4 or 5 decades, for the most part, you weren't getting too many people that were focusing on the methods or improving the methods, and we'll talk about somebody who was. But if you can see what happens when there are methodological problems, and it does lead to problems then with interpreting events in the real world, as I'll explain. So when we think about authoritarian, I think here's where we see the intersection then with fascism. Authoritarian basically comes from the Latin word meaning master or teacher or leader. So the authoritarian personality, kind of first sketched by this guy Erich Fromm, I think I mentioned last time. So he is, combining the theories of Karl Marx on capitalism, and then looking at, taking a Freudian lens then, or Freudian microscope, to sort of, what's happening at the unconscious level. As I talked about last time, both of those perspectives are somewhat problematic, and then kind of combining them together based on what we now know about, human consciousness, the brain, ecology, and so on. As I said, it raises some questions about this initial way of looking at things, but I'll wait till the next lecture on Wednesday so I can cover how it's measured. So basically, when we come up with a concept, and then what we're doing is we're doing something called conceptualization. Essentially, we've specified something about the world, and we are now trying to figure out how we can develop it into a theory, and basically into how we can essentially turn these words that measure objects and turn them into variables which we can then use in a research project as testable hypotheses. So your idea, you'll be thinking about some event in the real world. For me, it was, let's go back to my last one on urban growth, so sustainable development and urban growth and so on. That stuff was what I was thinking about, and then trying to, you start to learn the language. What do we mean by the language? Sort of the research language. So they'll be developing concepts and theories, which we'll talk about in a moment. Actually, I'll just go there now. So for example, one of them could, if you're looking at cities, you could develop, or you could build off of this thing called the urban growth machine. So this was developed by an urban sociologist who also at one time was at Santa Barbara, wrote, I think, the first article on the Santa Barbara oil spill. Anyway, he spent a long time then, after starting his research in Santa Barbara, then looking at New York and Chicago and all over. But what he found was he could always find this sort of group of business people within the community who oftentimes really steer the direction of the city, whether that be its finances, its development, the sort of partnerships that it fosters, and so on. So this was very interesting to me. And more than that, rather than just a group of business people, there's a big drive for profit, and that's really what Molich was focusing on. And he was saying that it's not simply capitalism. You couldn't just take it from a simple Marxist perspective, although some people would say that that's what this sounds like. But he would be, he wants to be more precise. Marx was very broad, just the capitalist class, capitalism. Molich here is being more precise, saying, okay, what good is happening then at done by the urban growth machine, but who is benefiting most from it. So we know that usually the more building that happens, the wealthier the city becomes. And that's why you often see this, this mantra for unrestricted growth happening by the real estate industry. So I was thinking about this and back in 2010 or so, and also watching, at that time we were in another recession and we were getting an urban, a stimulus for urban development and things like that. And I was just, I had moved to California relatively recently, so I was interested in how, populations are housed and how affordably they are and how sustainably so. And so I, began looking at urban development theories, and I was struck by Molich's theory of the urban growth machine. I thought it was very interesting. But I also thought maybe it could be expanded upon. And, if we think about what about the people who are in the urban growth machine who want to practice smart growth, that sort of high density, greener type of development, or enact certain growth restrictions, that kind of thing? Could there be a smart growth machine, a group of people who want to build and are certainly wanting to profit, but in a more sustainable way? They're, want to be careful about it and so on and so forth, is essentially what I developed my research on. And I decided to begin in Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara is a very interesting community in this sense. It has some of the tightest growth restrictions in the country. It's lauded as one of the top smart growth cities in America, and among a bunch of other indicators, it looks pretty good. However, there's also problems. The biggest problem is not limited to Santa Barbara, and we see it reflected across the country, but it's more acute in Santa Barbara, and that's housing affordability. So that was something that I initially hadn't intended to focus on a whole lot, but it became pretty clear that you can't really talk about urban development without talking about housing affordability. Now, as I said, to jump forward in time to some of the research that I'm doing now, looking at fascism and the authoritarian personality, and I say securitarian there. If you haven't taken a political social from me, you'll find out what that means in the next lecture. So when we think about fascism, I've talked about authoritarianism a little bit. What about fascism? So again, there's the concept of fascism, and sometimes there are different definitions that are developed, and sometimes they're walked back or modified and so on and so forth. And as I talked about Roger Griffin's definition in more detail, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that Roger Griffin, he started doing research on this in the 1990s. So I'm going to show a brief video that's interviewing Roger Griffin, and he talks about how he developed his research and certain things about it. So again, hopefully you'll learn, and we'll go on after this and get back into the methods, but hopefully you'll also learn something about fascism as well, which, something we should all probably be somewhat concerned about. So that was Roger Griffin describing his research on fascism. So this comes out of his book, Fascism is a Genus of Political Ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist nationalism. So he says that there are these sort of core areas that develop into this idea of fascism. And this kind of what he does is he uses Max Weber's idea of the ideal type, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But basically this, if you could break it down to its bare minimum, what is this, thing that we're talking about called fascism, and how do we define it? And you'll find that a lot of social science discussion goes into how we define concepts, because it's very important that we do. We are a semantic species, meaning that this is our primary way of communicating. And so when we ask a research question or make a thesis statement or research statement, anything like that, we have to be very sure of what we're saying. So anyway, he says that it's a palingenetic, and form of populist ultranationalism, and you heard him talk about how he called it revolutionary, type of revolutionary nationalism. Palingenetic, palin meaning kind of healing, and then genetic, sort of coming from culture. So this idea of, the culture that has felt they've been derided or degraded, or they feel under threat, and then they form a more stronger nationalistic orientation. That was Roger Griffin. As I said, he's not the only one who has done this work, but I think his work has probably been in many ways the most enlightening, at least in the last 4 or 5 decades. He had a bunch of the huge first volumes of research that were done on fascism and the world wars and so on in the 1940s and 1950s, and then they start to kind of fall for a bit, and you start to see a huge rise just in the last few years. Another major figure in this would be Stanley Payne, A History of Fascism, 1914 to 45. And remember, I'm giving you this to give you kind of a background in terms of how you develop your own research and your own research question. You'll be thinking, as you start to read the literature, you will look at these different authors and theorists, and you may come across some of these big names and different perspectives, and you'll have to kind of figure out which perspective seems like the one that works best. So one of the most important things when coming up with a research design, a research proposal, or just coming up with a research idea, is the operationalization of concepts. So you've developed these concepts, or you've sat there and went through the work of coming up with these bare minimum concepts. And this is really what Max Weber is talking about when he says the ideal type. Basically meaning an ideal type, meaning not idealism in the terms of like this is morally better or ethically superior or something like that. Ideal type means basically if you take for example fascism, and what does it mean? Well, there's people who might say that it means there's a lot of in-group feeling and wanting to protect the in-group, and others will say, well, there are a lot of groups that are like that but aren't necessarily fascist, and there'll be be some back and forth, well, maybe the fact that they often have a strong leader, that they're often opposed to movements for broader tolerance, and so on. Then researchers would have to kind of look at these different examples and see, which definition do we seem to find that holds true in as many different cases as possible. When you do something like that, you do start to sort of narrow it down, and pretty soon you've got this ideal type, this idea of what the perfect, or not the perfect, what the in terms of if you were doing comparative research, what would be the perfect case by which you could compare to test, a fascist versus a non-fascist government, or, different types of social policies, whether they work better or don't work as well. So anyway, we take these more abstract definitions that we come up with as concepts, and then we sort of from there develop, what are the indicators to determine the concept? One of my concepts in my research on urban development was green buildings, or sustainable construction. But in order to really get that from my imagination into data, into actually something that I could work with, you have to take that concept of sustainable development, green building, whatever, and then you have to develop, what would let me test for that? How would I figure out how to even begin looking for something like this? And so for me, it was, I'm looking at these building projects. I want them to be high density. So, higher density than, is the average in the city. I want them to have commercial space on the ground floor. I wanted them to be affordable to people in the median income, that kind of thing. And all of that then would go into this concept of green building, sustainable construction, and so on. But you would need to go through these different attributes. And I think your book talks about trust and race and kind of the ways in which you can, again, test for those, which, sometimes it's for people who aren't in sociology, they might wonder, why are you testing something that, is sort of everyday knowledge or something? Well, first of all, it's not. And second of all, we have to we're kind of taking that apart and seeing like, okay, where does that everyday knowledge even come from, and how well is it fit into the world of science and trying to understand everything and so on. Another operationalization, for example, major one that has a lot of consequences, the U.S. Census Bureau. So the operationalization of the concept of race in the census data. And you can see, there's various different ways you can count yourself or people in your family if you have to do that. I would often have someone from the census that was usually around on campus at Penn State and have them come in during this portion of the class, because they would really be working on these questions. So you've got kind of the main identities, but there's also this recognition that the word Asian by itself is not precise enough. Yes, it will differentiate Asian from African, from South American, European, and so on. That may not be very hopeful if you're trying to work specifically with a community that may or not be represented as well. So this is one way in which we see race constructed. And I think for a number of people it's been somewhat frustrating, because you'll get it, and if your parents happen to be of two races, or your grandparents, or whatever it might be, it really comes down to how you are, how you are seeing yourself and how you are raised to think about your identity and so on. And then, there's a very specific breakdown of the Hispanic, Latin, and Spanish origins questions as well. And I imagine we'll see, more changes in this area. Where they just finished the 2020 census. The 2030 census, I think, will show, some pretty big changes in America, because you'll have a lot of the generation that fought in the Second World War and lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War. A lot of that generation will be gone from the United States and the rest of the world. And I think that will have a profound effect on a lot of these things. So back to fascism, because that's the example I'm using today. So you can study it in two different ways. You can think about it as an ideology and a non-ideology. Now, you may not care about fascism at all. Remember, just think about how this may affect your own research and ways you can conceptualize and so on. So basically, after several decades and studies were done, the non-ideological approach, that maybe it has something to do with like economic factors or things like that as a sort of a driving force, has been pretty much dropped. And it's pretty much well understood that ideology is a leading determinant for fascist movements. I did want to also point out that Griffin, in that interview that we watched with Griffin, his method of investigating fascism is the same one that I've adopted for studying fascism and authoritarianism and all these different other adjectives that describe some political behaviors that we see on the rise in across the world, but across the world in liberal democracies is where I think it's most peculiar from a social perspective. So Griffin was, he was saying, how do I study fascists? Well, I read them. And that's, I think, a good thing to do. There are a lot of people, for example, many of my colleagues I know who, for example, will criticize capitalism endlessly and make lots of money doing so. But, they never sit down and read the Wall Street Journal or the Economist or the Financial Times. They don't read the economists and economic thinkers who are, imagining new things to do with fascism and so on and so forth. So anyway, those sort of ideas, the non-ideology has essentially been dropped, and we basically understand fascism as more of a cultural thing now than anything else. Now, I think one of the key things that is stressed in your book in this chapter, and that we'll be wrestling with for the next few weeks, is this, taking theory and wrestling it with reality. So, for example, there have been, thousands and thousands of studies now on fascism. So a lot of the work now is actually looking at past research, from the eyes of the 21st century, and kind of seeing, okay, what did they give, what did they miss, with the hindsight of hindsight to help us. This kind of goes back to sort of Max Weber and a lot of his ideas. As I said, there's the ideal type. So when Griffin was asked, how do I study fascists? He said, I read them. And so that's kind of what Carlos Martins does here in this study that came out last year, just a few months ago, actually, where he looks at fascist leaders and he looks at their speeches and he looks at the ideology that's coming out there. And it turns out this is actually something that has not received as much attention as you might think. So Weber, in case you don't know, he developed these three types, or he didn't develop it, he identified these three types of authority in society. The first was what he called traditional authority, and this was what we would think of as conservative. It relies on custom, the elders, patriarchal in nature, and so on. This is most of human society up until the modern period. Most people were in various forms of traditional societies. Right now, you actually see a traditionalist movement with a capital T. That's a broad-based sort of movement against liberalism, against the modern world, and really kind of emphasizing traditional values and so on. Anyway, Weber also discusses this rational authority that's based in legals and rules. It's a systematizing, analytic form of authority. This is most representative democracies in the world today, but not just democracies. China would fit in there as well. Anywhere where you have an organization that is developing very clear-cut, measured, evidence-based rules and so on and so forth, is much more analytical than other systems that may be based on tradition, on religion, on the elders, and so on. And then there's the third authority type that is based in personality. And Weber saw this, he called this the charismatic authority. There's personal charm. The people are very influential because of it. They tend to be very emotive. They're not, or at least they don't display their rational side, their systematizing or analytical side, but they do show their emotional side, whether it's anger or it's pride or whatever it might be. Those feelings, that sort of emotional intensity will be much greater with the charismatic type than the rational and most traditional types as well. When we look at how this, and I should say this has been, when Weber wrote this was in the early 1900s, and so he was thinking about Napoleon and other Caesar and other figures from history. And he died before Mussolini and fascism came along, and Hitler and Mao and so on and so forth. You get these really identifiable charismatic leaders after Weber died. But we can go back in history and see these sort of leaders kind of scattered about. So another researcher who looks at these sorts of things, communities and so on, is a guy named Benedict Anderson, and he wrote this famous book back in the 1980s, I believe, even earlier perhaps, called Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. So again, he developed this major concept that has been hugely influential, not just on studies of nationality and communities and stuff like that, but or political communities, but it's also been used to look at ethnic neighborhoods, to look at basically anywhere people are and what they think is around them. Rural communities, and often you will find that people's imagined community doesn't always match up to reality, and there's different ways in which skilled leaders have learned to sort of tailor their messages to the various audiences within the nation. The challenge, or I should say, one of the major differences between, say, the nationalism of the early 1900s and that of the 21st century is we're much more multicultural. First of all, there are about 3 or 4 billion more humans on Earth than there were back then. About 3 billion, 4. 5? Yeah, 4 or 5 more. It's roughly 1920 here. So anyway, there's just more people, and we've been moving around more than any other time in history. Oop. So Weber, then, this becomes a hugely influential concept. And as I've said, you see it now being applied to whole ranges of social activities, and we can see that these imagined communities can do a lot to make people think of who they are. And when their imagined community faces a reality, it can be quite traumatic and disrupting and so on. So I did want to kind of continue. Okay, so if we're looking at fascism and we want to study it, as I said, a lot of the research on fascism has been done. There's been a few decades of it, but there's still places to find more information. So Carlos Manuel Martins was interested in the development of fascism and so on, and he decided to look at the ideology of their leaders by looking at those speeches and so on. And so he looked, first of all, by reviewing the literature, and he found that oftentimes when people are looking for individual fascists that, displayed the mindset and so on, they would often find intellectuals, philosophers, other thinkers who helped to develop the ideas of the fascist. Others pointed out, like Stanley Payne said, that they required an authoritarian leader to have more militant ability than we see previous governments having. Then most, I'd say that basically, if you try to describe the fascist movements without really talking about their leaders, it's kind of like describing the body without the soul. Which I'm not sure if he was meaning that literally or not, but basically, some of the more structural approaches really kind of glossed over the individual and the role that individuals like Mussolini had and like Hitler had. And I think some of the best work in sociology, just pure basic sociology, has been done by Michael Mann down at UCLA. He has been looking at this sort of research for quite some time. Back when I was in college, he had just come out with The Dark Side of Democracy, explaining ethnic cleansing. I started my research on ethnic cleansing in Darfur in roughly 2004, and so I was reading that book, and it had a pretty profound impact on me at the time. So once again, I think one of the great things about sociologists is that we are very versatile with what level we're going to work on in terms of getting information. So we can go to the very broad, macro level of the governments and civilizations and so on. We can also look at the individuals, and all of that can be captured within various sociological theories and measurements. measurement is extraordinarily important and extraordinarily difficult depending on what it is you're trying to measure. So measuring, when we talk about measurement in research, in the research context, we're talking about how to link abstract concepts to empirical indicators. Indicants? I meant to say indicators. So essentially, how are we going to conduct our research? There are different ways that this is done depending on your research. So you could ask people questions. So if you're doing research on, say, court cases, you could read judicial opinions if you wanted to get an idea perhaps where, say, abortion law is going. You could read judicial opinions from the Supreme Court over the years on it, or you could read them at the various other levels of the court system. And that will give you, various different types of empirical indication. You can observe social interactions, as we'll talk about in a moment, and coding words in books, which is something I think I do on a fairly daily basis. So the observing social interactions, that is best done if you can do it without being obtrusive. So it would be an unobtrusive measure where you basically kind of just hang out around wherever it is that you're doing research, and you take notes, or you do, video record, or you take pictures. It all kind of depends. If you're interviewing people, you may have to get some sort of consent beforehand. If you're just video recording the broad scene, obviously you're not going to have to ask everyone. Some of the most interesting research in this area was kind of spearheaded by Michel Dunier. This book he did called The Sidewalk, which was later turned into a film, just kind of looking at how the space of the sidewalk was used, essentially how it turned into a social space, and how just examining the different dynamics of that social space. And so he was able then to take from it, a lot of interview data, a lot of video data, a lot of photography, and so on and so forth, looking at it from different angles, different ways, and all of it then being used to then go into these research monographs. And then later, after Sidewalk, he wrote this book called Ghetto, referring to it as, the invention of a place, the history of an idea. So again, you can tell he's a sociologist. He's kind of like Harvey Mallich and the Smart Growth Machine. The ghetto is it a real place? How has it been developed? Is it the same everywhere? And it's very different. The ghetto of the initial, where the Jews were put in Poland, versus what we call the ghetto today, where it's mainly brown people in large urban areas. Those are two very, very, very different things. But they're used. They're still used with the same word. So I think it's a challenge is to sort of break free of that, because it is sort of it's in some ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And once someplace is called a ghetto, then it won't take long before it might become one. So one of the things then is we have to come up with these variables, things that we want to test. We kind of come up with different attributes, and we can figure out, okay, what is the different ways in which we can test them. So looking at, I'm going to your book now, concepts, variables, and indicators. So different types of concepts. It could be like gang membership, poverty, socioeconomic status, fascist, political group. Then variables, self-reported gang membership, poverty, subjective or absolute. And then again, absolute being, as the book discusses, this official measure used by the government, this formula to determine whether or not someone is in absolute poverty. Subjective poverty is more, do you think you're poor, or are you poor by the standards of your society? gang membership. You could also think of, political party affiliation, variables. You could say whether they are or not. You could do a self-reported indicator. You could also look up the list of, people, how they have voted, or list of party members, and so on and so forth. So what you'll be doing basically is you're going to be wanting to find out, or you'll be using these sort of concept variables, and then you're going to be developing indicators. And just keep in mind as you're doing this, remember, you don't have to actually do this study. It's, you're just developing the research proposal, but we will be, wanting it to be as precise and clear as possible. Now, we can look at things at different scales. So some of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with some of these. There's, first of all, the nominal scale, which categorizes items. So, types of coffee, or, political values and belief systems, and so on. You also have, and I should say that's the only non-numerical scale here. And so basically all qualitative research, virtually all qualitative research is done on the nominal scale. The ordinal scale is one that ranks and orders items. So, the Likert scale is a good example of that. I'll talk about that in a moment. Interval data basically has equal interviews, and the ratio scale is similar, and basically a zero that has a zero that means the absence or none of the thing that is being measured. And there are kind of, again, different ways you can think about doing this. Categories, nominal data, ordinal categories. You've got ordered categories, student letter grades, A, B, C, and D, if you've heard of those. Service quality ratings. Then you've got interval data, which is the difference between measurements but no true zero. Temperature in Fahrenheit, standardized exam score. Not a lot of clear social data, but sometimes you can find some difference between the ratio and the interval data. In the ratio data, their true zero does exist, and so you're much more likely to find sociological research on ratio data. And again, kind of just showing how it goes up. So why is it seen that, ratio is better than some of these other categories? You're just getting more precise, and you're getting, much more fine-tuned, fine-grained look at the data than you are with, especially like nominal categories. Ordinal is getting closer, and ratio and interval, kind of depends on what you're doing. And this is one of my favorite memes of all time for some reason. Okay. That was a moment of humor. Okay, so again, I talked about the nominal level, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it other than to kind of point out that these are categorical variables, and they are mutually exclusive if everyone can share only one attribute. These attributes are exhaustive when every case can be classified into one of the categories. So like I said, with the ordinal measure, the ordinal level, that's looks at the rank and order of different categories. So you can see the good example of it is the Likert scale. We'll talk about this more when we talk about survey construction next time. But essentially, it's ranked. How do you feel today? Number 1, very unhappy. Number 5, very happy. And then you've got the different levels of measurement there beforehand. And again, the ratios, income, height, weight, annual sales, market share, product defect rates, time to purchase, unemployment, and crimes. These are all ratio level data. And again, just kind of another way in which you can look at things and how they sort of, come into being, so to speak. And again, we'll see how these assist us in our research as we go over the next few days and few weeks. Now, there are special cases of dichotomies, and it kind of depends on the research that you're doing. Oftentimes, it's often nominal data, but nevertheless, you can I find that it will have two values or only two values. So example would be attributes of liberals and conservative, the attributes of gender, which are just dichotomized for analysis, not for, I don't know why I'm dichotomizing them just for analysis, but, generally speaking. Attributes of prisoners and non-prisoners, and then attributes of rural and urban. So basically where you have to be like one or the other, and sometimes this can be very interesting for carrying out research and acknowledging how complicated some of these things can get. So again, qualitative, and just trying to drum this into your head in different ways. So qualitative measures, you've got the flags that are denoting where people are, and then you've got an ordinal level of measurement, and this is the level of conflict in society. But it's not correct, right? I mean, I think American society is more conflict than British and Canadian. Definitely more gun violence. So I don't know. This one seems a little bit off. Interval/ratio level of measurement. So size, the size can matter and really, kind of throw things off if you have too few members for your research. The other thing that you then want to do is your unit of analysis. And this has always been a challenge for me in my research, because you oftentimes have to narrow it down. But I would often find during my research that, before you can get to narrow it down, you have to expand it. You have to sort of get an even, broader bird's eye view of the terrain, of what you're doing research on. And then you can kind of zoom in after that. At least that's my general approach. So I knew that I was interested in the conflict that was happening in Darfur, and this was, again, this sort of inductive case that I built up from from the initial research up into the world of theory, rather than a deductive approach, which would have been theory to world, so to speak. So the unit of analysis, then what is it? So I looked at different time periods. So very different type of unit of analysis, different eras, different economic and cultural, political periods that I had identified in Darfur history. I also looked at different, various regions, different tribes, all of these different things. So there are a lot of different units of analysis. There were different levels of it, going from the international, where, you've got the neighboring countries, the global, you got all the money that's coming in. And then you have the different tribes that are living in different areas. You've got different cities here, and so on and so forth. Before that, when I was doing research up in Oregon and down here in California on urban development, there, I started by knowing that I was interested in sustainable urban development. But in order to, look at those buildings, I had to zoom out and look at the broader connection that these cities had. And I don't think the research could have been as informative without that sort of zoom out, zoom in view. Or perspective taken. So, for example, I looked at Milwaukee and Gresham, and I basically went around to a number of these suburbs and looked at these projects there. So, and I went and did the same thing in Southern California. So you may recognize this from Chapala Street in Santa Barbara, but this is one of the building projects I was looking at, mixed use on the ground floor, residential space up above. But then I would have to, figure out, okay, how am I going to look at this? And, then there would be, again, different levels. So it'd be like the region, then the city, then maybe it kind of depend then. It might be the company that developed the project, or the property managers, that kind of thing. But it would often then go to zero down to these kind of individual level areas. So as I said, I looked at different tribes in Darfur. So basically what was happening was the northern camel herding Abala tribes had been militarized for about a couple of decades. There had been a drought going on, so they were losing land and their herds. And so they were also militarized. And then the government used them as sort of like shock troops and used them to put down an insurgency, where the people, the Fur, are farming, and they're all Muslim, but the Fur don't consider themselves as having an Arabic lineage, whereas the Abala and the Bagara tribes do. And they, for the most part, lived relatively peacefully up until the 1980s as the drought situation worsened. Kind of going back and forth between these two. Okay, so one of the things, though, that we have to be careful about is this thing called the ecological fallacy. And this is why I think it's so important to have that sort of, kind of zoom in, zoom out view, because this is when we make an error about individual level processes because of group level data that we might have. So we might have data on, these smart growth projects working fairly well in some cities, but if we don't have more looking at the project themselves, or people that funded them and developed them, then we might have run into some problems. This is where stereotypes and cliches come in, where your kind of common mindset will go. Our schemas, as that first slide showed, are never quite perfect. They don't quite match the reality. There's sort of in our minds, they're amalgamations of these different features and attributes and so on. But we do see that they can become problematic for research because they can sort of get in the way of productive analyses. Then sort of the opposite is what's called the reductionist fallacy. And this is where basically what you know about the group, you sort of project based upon what you know about individual level data. So again, this could be looking at, say some fascist leader and, say that that Mussolini is completely different than everyone else, and he's just, or actually it would be better to say Mussolini and Hitler, those are the best examples of fascist leaders, and everyone has to conform to that type. And, if they're not, trying to start ethnic cleansing, then they're not really fascist or something like this. There could be a lot of problems you can imagine by starting out with someone's individual biography and then trying to contextualize off of that from that. We often, again, are we can characterize whole groups completely wrongly, or and so on, because of this sort of reasoning fallacy. So again, breaking it down into where you're usually going to get data. It's usually going to be from groups or individuals, and you're basically going to have to make certain sort of decisions about what could be, what the fallacies could be. So, if you're doing groups, you would say more homogeneous. Groups tend to have stronger social bonds. Individuals at the individual level, individuals who socialize more have lower grades. So schools with more social engagement will have poorer student performance. And you can already see there's problems there. They're saying this students who socialize more have low grades. So we know that, okay, generally students who are not doing their homework don't do as well on their homework. So, schools, the reasoning then is that schools with more social engagement will have poorer student performance. But it may depend on the type of social engagement. If they're engaging, but they're engaging in, discussion or an activity on the class material, that's going to be much better than if they're, looking at videos on their phone, watching, the latest TikTok dances and so on. Another one, older people tend to be more conservative. Again, that's pretty straight, clear statement, and there's no fallacy there. You do see it in this one. Groups with a higher average age are more conservative, so older people are more conservative. Again, you can see that there's a bit of a fallacy there. You have because this and then. So, whenever there's that, so older people are more conservative, you can often identify some of these fallacies when in the constructions of their sentences like that. Okay, so that I think is where I'll just stop it today. You can use the rest of this time to rewatch it or go through the book. I would go along with the book and kind of look at these different examples, and you can start to see how they're developed. On Wednesday, I'll be talking about the research paper in much more detail. All right, everyone, have a good afternoon.